Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to week 6 of communication skills. I hope you're having a great week. It is a beautiful, sunshiny day here in northeast Arkansas. The sun is shining, the rain has stopped, and that's really important because the river beside my house is within a couple of feet of topping the levee, and if that ever happens, we're in serious trouble. We're going to have to float our way out or something. I don't know. It's never happened in history, but the river is approaching, or it is at its fifth highest level in history. So we're hoping that there is no more rain in the forecast, that things continue to dry up, and the river has a chance to go down. It runs down pretty quickly as it flows downstream. So hopefully we've seen the worst of it, but time will tell. It is coming into spring, and spring is always a wet season for us. This week, we're going to do a couple of things. First of all, I want to make you aware that the midterm is next week. And I have posted a midterm review document. I'm going to put it on there in 3 different places, or 2 different places. I'm going to put it in the Files tab. I'm going to create a page that will contain it. Then I may also make a discussion post. So 2 or 3 different ways I'm going to put it out there. It's all the same. You don't have to get it from each source. The midterm review is basically 100 multiple choice questions that are drawn from chapters 1 through 12 and chapter 18. That's the material that your midterm will cover. Now, your midterm will be 50 multiple choice questions that span the same material that I'm giving to you in this study guide. So it will be very beneficial for you. If you work your way through the review questions, with the book and determine what the proper answers are to each of those questions before you get around to taking the test, study from that document, and you will do perfectly fine on the test. The midterm is next week. It'll go live on Wednesday and will be live for 1 week. And so that is week 7 of our class. And it's a 15-week course. I know it's hard to find a middle point, a 15-week course, but we have 1 week remaining after week 7 before we go on spring break. So I wanted to go ahead and get the midterm out of the way. It will take place next week. It'll post on Wednesday, and it'll be due by midnight the following Tuesday night. Don't forget to take it, first of all. Don't forget to study for it. If you'll just take the time to work your way through these 100 questions, you can even team up together, get a group together, form a study group, whatever you want to do. But just make sure nobody's just leeching off of you and getting your work and using it for their benefit. Make sure everybody is contributing, and study this together, and it'll prepare you for the midterm. The midterm will be no harder than anything that is on this document that you're going to get this week from Canvas. Now, this week we're focusing on chapter 11 and chapter 12. Chapter 11 has to do with introducing your speech, and chapter 12 has to do with your closing your speech. I'm also including another video, YouTube video of an instructor talking about introductions and closings that I think will be beneficial for you. It builds on the same subject material that we're going to cover in the chapter and in these brief lectures online. So those are the things you're going to see show up in Canvas this week. First of all, let's talk about chapter 11, introducing your speech. Audience members quickly make impressions about you, and what they decide about you and what you're going to say is going to determine whether or not they listen to your speech. So you have to capture their attention from the very beginning. Stephen C. Rafe, an author who wrote a book called How to Be Prepared to Speak on Your Feet, said you have to develop the best possible opening, one that will catch your audience's attention from the first words you speak. The introduction is how you do that. The introduction should be, in normal speech preparation, it's going to be the last part of the speech that you write. It should take up about 10% of the speaking time in the speech, which means if you're giving a 10-minute speech, then your introduction should be 60 seconds or so. It's just a small segment of the speech, but it is an effective segment. The introduction captures the attention and interest and builds your credibility and goodwill and orients your listeners to the organizational pattern that your speech is going to follow. You've got a whole lot to pack into that 60 seconds or 30 seconds if it's a 5-minute speech. So that not a lot of time, but a lot of big things to accomplish in that time. One way to get your audience's attention is to startle them or shock them in the introduction. Startling statements are effective, but you have to remember they should be honest, they should be ethical, and they should not be off color. If you choose to shock your audience into listening, make sure that what you say is appropriate. This is not the place for off-color humor. This is not the place to introduce something that's likely to divide your audience before you ever get started. And also, an introduction that only possesses shock value but is not connected to the rest of the speech will do nothing but confuse your audience. If you choose to use a shocking introduction to get their attention, then make sure that it relates to where you're going with the speech. Audiences that are involved in the speech are also more likely to immerse themselves in the topic. So whenever you're giving your introduction, you want to convince your audience that this is a topic that directly affects them. If you do that, if you can make it important to them in that small segment at the beginning, they're more likely to pay attention to everything else that you say because people care about what affects them. Another effective way to approach your introduction is to arouse curiosity or build suspense. These things will engage your audience. One way you can do that is with questions. You may ask a rhetorical question. That's a question that needs no direct answer, or it causes your audience to begin to think. What it does is it arouses the curiosity of your audience, and it begins to build suspense. Just make sure that if you're using a rhetorical question to introduce your speech, that your speech is aimed at helping the audience derive an answer for that question. Don't just pose a rhetorical question that has nothing to do with the body of your speech. It needs to be, if you're going to use that kind of device, you use the question at the beginning, you provide all the evidence throughout to help steer the audience to an answer, and you revisit that question in your closing, which is what we talk about in chapter 12. But you tie it all back together. So if you're going to use a rhetorical question, make sure that it relates to the body of your speech. Another effective technique that you can use in opening or introducing your speech is a quotation. Quotes can be used to impress the audience and attract their attention. If you quote a well-known figure or somebody that they respect, that will arouse their interest and draw them in. Even quoting an ordinary person, but a quote that is pertinent to the audience will arouse their attention, draw them in, get them to pay attention to what you're going to say next. Another mode of communication that you can use in this introduction is humor. And humor can be used to capture the audience's attention if it is directly connected to the content of the speech. Humor for the sake of humor alone will get you nowhere. But if you can say something that is humorous to your audience and relates to the speech and where you're going, just like with the rhetorical question, it can be tied in, and then in your closing, you can revisit that humorous moment, then that can be powerful. If you use it properly, it can connect your audience to you in a unique and powerful way. But don't use humor, once again, don't use humor that may be offensive. If you think your humor might divide your audience or be offensive to your audience, don't use humor to start your speech. Only use humor if you feel like it's going to be relatable to your audience and you can relate it to the rest of your speech. Another method you can use is to arouse emotions. Arousing emotions engages your audience. People become emotionally invested and all of a sudden they're paying attention. One way to arouse emotion is using stories such as illustrations or examples to capture your listeners' attention and interest. Stories add color to a speech. We all like it when a preacher uses a story to make his point. As a matter of fact, there are sermons, you don't remember the title, you don't remember the text, you really don't remember the point, overall point of the sermon, but you remember the illustration. Stories give emphasis, they give power, they connect to the audience, they draw the audience in to what is being said. And if they're used right, they help the audience remember what you were talking about. There are other sermons you remember the story, and because you remember the story, you remember what the sermon was about. And the sermon and the story were very closely connected. So stories are powerful. They make the ideas in the speech less abstract and more concrete. They make the content of the speech seem to be more real. They are valuable tools that you can use in your introduction, that you can revisit in your closing, that bring everything together around the purpose of your speech. Now, aside from capturing your audience's attention and engaging them in your ideas, your introduction should establish your credibility. Part of your job is to convince the people that are listening to you that you're knowledgeable, that you're a believable source. And so you've got to convince them that you're credible. And credibility is based on the audience's judgment of your expertise of the topic. Are you qualified to speak on it? Do you know what you're talking about? Do you have a reason or to be an authority figure in this subject? And so you want to establish that in your introduction. You may give a short statement about what your qualifications are, what your experience is, what it is that gives you the right to speak about this, and establishes your credibility in the mind of your audience. Your audience's initial impression of you will be based on how you look, and I've mentioned this in several of the speaker introductions. I'm getting those graded. You'll have them all back by this weekend. But the way you look, your appearance in speeches for this class should be professional. And the reason for that is the way that you look affects how you are perceived by your audience. It affects what you say. It affects how what you say is received by your audience. And so that's also true in your introduction. The initial impression that people are going to get about your speech comes from your introduction. Once you walk into a room, you give an impression of the way you look and your appearance and your level of confidence. Those things are things that you don't get another chance at. Once they're established, they're established. The audience has already formed an opinion of you. The same is true with your introduction. When you start talking and you begin to speak, you have just a very few short moments to capture their attention, to establish your credibility, and to draw them in and give them a good impression of you and what you're about to say. If at the end of the introduction, your audience believes that you're qualified to speak on the topic, that they believe that you can identify with them and they identify with you, then they're going to respond to you because they like you. They trust you. They've deemed you to be credible in their eyes. If you pay attention to the way your audience listens to you, then you can use your attitude, your demeanor, and the content of your speech to increase your credibility in their eyes. Listeners will be encouraged to listen to you if they believe that you are concerned about them and their well-being. You don't just step in front of an audience and speak on a subject for the sake of the subject alone. You have to connect the subject to your audience. Let them know that you care about them. This is for their benefit. That's a powerful way to connect your audience into what you're talking about and get them to pay attention through the rest of the speech.